All right, let's turn to Genesis 39. Genesis 39. As we think about Joseph's life, we think about the theme of Joseph's life. I think we find that in verse number 21, which we covered last time. And that is, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. This one phrase, if Joseph had a tombstone and we were to put one phrase on that tombstone, it would be this: the Lord was with Joseph. Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers. He had been lied on by his master's wife. He had been wrongly put into prison. But the Lord was with him. This is the testimony of Joseph's life. And really, that's all that mattered. That's all that mattered. Well, what was the effect of this? Well, verse 22. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was a doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Now, we have a teaching today in Christianity called prosperity gospel, in which they take the scriptures in the Bible that talk about prosperity, and there are scriptures that talk about prosperity, and they make them very worldly, a worldly sort of prosperity. If you were going to give a biblical definition of prosperity, what would you say? Do you have any ideas? Prosperity, what would you say?
Wealthy.
Okay, wealthy. What else? Roger.
Prosperous in the area where you're at, or in the,
What's that?
prosperous in the field you're in, or something.
Okay, prosperous in the field you're in. Prosperous where you're at. Once again, you are using the word in the definition. And so my English teacher, if she'd have been a Catholic nun, would have slapped me on the right here with her ruler. So maybe it's another word you would use for prosper. Ooh, succeed. That's a good word for that. Okay, succeed in the calling. Ooh, let's make it more spiritual. Succeed in the place where God has placed you. That would be a good word for prosperity. Anything else? And so I think another question that would be asked, as we have one person who said wealth is prosperity, is what is wealth? What is wealth? You know, you have a man and he has millions of dollars. He's got a big mansion. And yet, you know, at age 43, he has a stroke and he cannot walk. You know, he cannot communicate very effectively. And he hires the best of nurses, right? Because he's very wealthy. So he's got this great nurse that comes in and, you know, helps him go to the bathroom and helps him to eat. You know, so what is wealth, right? That's one of the things they keep pushing on us at the prison is health is wealth. That's what they say. And they say, of course, that's what the world, you know, if you're not healthy, what good's all the money in the world, right? You work yourself in the ground. You know, I had to take someone to a cancer treatment this week, relatively young, you know, and he was in the mines for a lot of his life, and black lung cancer, you know, he said he was making the money when he was in the mines. But you know what? What good does that money do, right? If you can't breathe and you have cancer and you're dying. And so I think wealth is a good word for prosperity. But what is wealth, right? You know, the Bible says you can gain the whole world. But what good is it if you lose your soul in hell, right? And so I think we could all agree that there is temporal, earthly wealth, and then there's heavenly riches and wealth. And so I think that not only is how much money is in your bank, what your portfolio looks like, I don't think that's an only indication of wealth either. You know, I mean, it's a wealthy thing. One of the wealthiest things I've got is I've got a wife to come home to, I've got 6 kids. It's a wealthy thing, and they're in Sunday school this morning. That's a wealthy thing, right? And these are the things, when I was single, sometimes I would come home, I'd open my apartment door, I'd say, honey, I'm home. And guess what? Nobody would answer. I didn't even have a dog, It was kind of quiet in there. So I go get my tuna fish, and put it on some crackers, and open up a bag of potato chips, and just eat whatever I had there. But anyway, prosperity. I've got a definition here. See if you agree with it. To align with God's purposes. To bear spiritual fruit that endures forever. This kind of prosperity that I just defined for you does not shield God's children from trials. And that was definitely true in the life of Joseph. God made everything in the life of Joseph to prosper. Well, then why did he end up in the pit? Why did his brothers throw him in the pit? Why did he end up having this great master he had as a slave in relative terms, Potiphar? Why did his wife lie on him? Why did he end up in prison? How can you say he was prospering? Well, he's prospering because his life lined up with God's purposes. And he was bearing spiritual fruit. We see in verse 21, he had favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. That's prosperity. Jesus grew in what? Favor with God and man. That's what we ought to do as well. Let's look at Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1. We see prosperity. How do we prosper? Everybody ought to want to prosper. So how do we prosper? Joshua chapter 1, verses 7 through 9. Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest what? Prosper whithersoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. There's that word that goes with it. Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. We see one thing here, a parallel between Joshua talking to the children of Israel and Joseph. It's talking about prosperity, it's talking about success, and it says, the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. Wherever Joseph went, God was with him. Jehovah was with him. Therefore he prospered. But what is the tool? Verses 7 through 9. What is the tool that God uses to help us to prosper? What do we see there in those verses? The Bible, that's right. Now it's referred to here as the law, the book of the law. But as Joshua is the 6th book of the Bible. And so the first 5 books of the Bible are the books of Moses. So the books of Moses had been written down. And what this is saying is if you want to prosper, you need to do 2 things with the Bible. You need to think about the Bible, and you need to obey the Bible. Okay? Now you can't think about the Bible if you don't know the Bible. So how do you get to know the Bible? Well, you read the Bible. You come to Sunday school. You come to church. You learn about the Bible. That's where prosperity comes from. And then you don't just learn about it, but you do it. Like, my wife said that forever scarred soccer player on my little team of 8-year-olds or 7-year-olds. This little girl had just never done much on the team. She finally, I was so proud of her. She touched that ball. She got in the game. And my wife says, don't just touch the ball, kick it. Okay. I was like, no. And she never came back on the soccer field again. She always played in the creek beside the soccer field. But anyway, I like to remind my wife of her traumatic influence over that one girl. But anyway, when it comes to the Bible, don't just know the Bible, apply it to your life. Do it. Because all that knowledge can puff up. You can be like some people I've seen. They can argue apologetics. They can tell you what this catechism says, or this book says, or this theologian says. But you don't just know the Bible, you do it. You live it. And then you will have success, and you will be prosperous. Even if you end up persecuted like Joseph was, and in prison. Okay, lied on, betrayed by his brothers, and all of that. Look at Psalm 1. Let's see if there is a connection here with what we just read. The Bible is written by one author, so I suppose there will be a connection here. And that author is God. All right, Psalm 1, the first 3 verses. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law does he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall, what's that last word? Prosper. Delight in the law of the Lord, and meditate in it day and night. How would you define the word delight without using the word delight? Okay. All right. How would you define the word delight? Be happy with. That's good. What do you think?
It's delight in your life.
Okay. He's using the word delight, trying to be smart. Okay. All right. I would use the word enjoy. Enjoy being around. Enjoy fellowshipping with. That'd be to delight. Delight yourself in the Lord. The Bible says, and he will give you the desires of your heart. If you want to please God, if you love God, then you will only ask for those things that please God, that he would want. So delight in the law of the Lord. I remember one time my kids were just devouring these Dilbert books, these cartoon books. And I said, you know what? They need to spend less time in Dilbert and more time in the Bible. So I brought them to the trailer because they were just all these characters. They were learning them. They loved it. I said maybe that's what homeschoolers do. They read Dilbert cartoons. But anyway, they were delighting in it. And so this is the way we need to feel about the Bible. It's God speaking to us. We delight in it. We enjoy it. We meditate in it. We think about it. And then we do it. And when we put those things together, we prosper. And we have success in God's eyes. Any thoughts about that? We're setting the tempo for Joseph's entire life right here. The Lord was with him, and everything he did prospered. Chapter 40. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. The word offended means they had sinned against him. And the Pharaoh was wroth against 2 of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. So we see 2 characters here. Joseph is going about his daily duties there in the prison. God has given him favor with the keeper, kind of like, in a local prison, you might have inmate workers. Except I think Joseph was probably trusted a little bit more than some of these inmate workers at the local prison. But anyway, so he is just doing his job, and the warden comes to him, the keeper of the prison, says, Joseph, here's 2 people. They've come from Pharaoh's household, and you're in charge of them. You serve them. You make sure their needs are met. And so this is what happens. Who are these 2 people? One was the Pharaoh's chief butler. Now, you think about movies and butlers. You think about the guy, who comes in the room and the husband and wife are in the parlor. And he says, "Can I serve you a drink?" That's kind of who the butler is. In this case, he's the cupbearer to the Pharaoh. The baker, the chief baker here, is the cook. So you've got the cupbearer and the cook. They're thrown into prison, and Joseph is put in charge of making sure they're taken care of while they're in prison. They were very important men. Very important men. If you make an honest living and you contribute to society, there is no important job or unimportant job, okay? I often say, I still remember Mr. Tunstall, the guy who was the custodian at the elementary school I went to. We loved him. We threw up, he cleaned it up. We made a mess in the bathroom, he cleaned it up. He was important, and he was a friendly custodian, friendly janitor. There's no unimportant jobs. And you think about this, you think, this is the cupbearer and the cook. But think about that. They controlled the Pharaoh's food and drink. And they would protect the king of Egypt from poison. So the cupbearer is going to make sure that wine or whatever he's bringing the Pharaoh, it doesn't have poison in it. And the baker is making sure the food doesn't have any poison. Those are pretty important positions, the cook and the butler. Okay, verses 5 through 7. And they dreamed a dream, both of them. Each man his dream in one night. Each man according to the interpretation of his dream. The butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? So here he is, Joseph, just like he does every day, comes in to see the cupbearer and the baker. And they were both sad. And if you were Joseph and you'd been put in a pit by your brothers and you'd been wrongly accused by your master's wife and you'd been thrown into prison, you'd probably be like some of the workers up at the prison here in the area. You do your job, but you really don't have any sort of compassion or care, for the people you're serving. But not Joseph. Joseph was a spiritual man. And Joseph asked these men, why are you so sad today? Everything's important. If he'd have never asked this question, if he'd have been distant and bitter and angry, he would have never got the answer to that question. And he may have never interpreted their dreams. It's good to be kind. It's good to be kind. And he was being kind to them here. He was concerned about them. He was actually, because, if he was just putting on an act, they would have said, get lost, you Hebrew. Get lost. You slave, get out of here. But no, he was genuinely concerned. He'd built a relationship with these men. And until we build relationships with people, we're not going to be able to help them or minister to them. So anyway, verse number 8, and they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. Now, dreaming a dream, this is how God often communicated with people in the Old Testament, through dreams. We didn't have, a Bible with 66 books we could go to figure out what God's will was for our lives, or is for our lives. And so they had this dream, and they could sense, I believe, that this was some sort of a prophetic dream, and they said there's no interpreter for it. When they were in the king's household, they could have probably had access to the magicians and the wise men who might be able to interpret the dream for them. Here they are. They're in prison. They've had this life-impacting dream. And they're like, we don't have anybody to interpret it for us. And so Joseph said, well, men, you're in luck. I can interpret dreams. Is that what Joseph said? No. What did he say? He said what? Do not interpretations belong to who? God. I'll tell you something else Joseph is always doing. He's always giving God the credit and giving God the glory. And so, this is a common phrase you're going to find Joseph using throughout his life. Joseph's God, not Joseph, can explain what their dreams mean. And so Joseph asked for them to tell him their dreams. And then Joseph is saying here, perhaps my God will choose to interpret them for you. To God be the glory. I think it's sola de gloria. Is that right, Elijah? Is that the phrase? To the glory of God alone. That's how we ought to live. I remember having someone come in this church and sat on that front pew right over there with a suit on. And he came here and he said, brother, and he filled in the blank, brother so-and-so saved me. Brother so-and-so got me saved. And right then when he said that, red flags went up. And sure enough, he was here for a few weeks, sitting on that front pew with his suit on. And all of a sudden, he stopped coming to church. And to talk to him, just cold as can be. Well, why is that? Well, it's because brother so-and-so saved him, and not the Lord, right? And so we see here Joseph. Oh, yeah, I had dreams when I was young, and I can interpret dreams. No. Do not interpretations belong to God. Tell me your dream, and perhaps God will choose to tell you what they mean. So the cupbearer, verses 9 to 11. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me. And in the vine were 3 branches. And it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. So here's the dream. A vine with 3 branches grew clusters of grapes. They went from the earliest stages of the grape all the way to them being ripe in the dream. And the grapes were squeezed, and it was squeezed into Pharaoh's cup, and the cupbearer gave the cup to Pharaoh. And what do you think that means? Well, we wouldn't have any clue if it wasn't for Joseph's God. Verse 12. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. So here it is. In 3 days, young man, you're going to get your position back. Congratulations. In 3 days, you're going to be bearing the cup before the Pharaoh again, just like you were before. Congratulations. Okay. Well, in verses 14 and 15, Joseph says, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. And so Joseph says, look, when this happens, when my dream comes true, when you understand that God is speaking through me, the God, the Creator God, I want you to show me kindness by asking the Pharaoh to free me from this prison, because I am innocent. I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be in this place. And so we see here Joseph kind of arguing for himself, pleading for himself here. So verse 16 and 17, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And so he's like, wow, that is a really good dream and a great interpretation. Hey, what you going to say to me? Now, if Joseph was a fake and he was doing what's called hedging his bets, he would have told the cook that his dream was good and that he'd be serving Pharaoh once again. And when he got to serve Pharaoh, put in a good word for me with Pharaoh, because I am innocent. But in order to show that this was from God, not only did this first dream get an interpretation in a positive way, but the second dream got an interpretation in a negative way. So Joseph is honest, verses 18 and 19. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. He's like, yes, 3 days, yes. Yet within 3 days, it's like he repeats himself, yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Ooh. Not a good interpretation. In 3 days the cook will be hung from a tree, and the birds will eat his flesh. Okay. But this is to show, I think, to the butler that Joseph wasn't just making this up out of thin air, but that Joseph actually had a gift from God to be able to truly interpret dreams, and that this might come in handy in Pharaoh's court. So what happened? Verse 20 through 22. It came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. So he's feeling good. It's his birthday, and he's going to do something kind for somebody. Some people said this may be the anniversary of when he started his rule. We don't know, but we just take it for his birthday. That he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Someone comes into the prison. Good news, guys. You get to go back to the palace. Okay, sounds great. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. And this is the point, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Freedom, freedom. It's here, right? Verse 23. Because he's prospering, right? He's prospering. He's going to be successful, right? Yes, Joseph. Verse 23. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgat him. Oh. And how long did he forget him for? Well, we'll give you a little sneak preview. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. 2 more years, Joseph is in prison. Is Joseph prospering? Yes. God's timing is always perfect. If Joseph had been released from prison at this point, then the future events that happened in his life would have probably never happened. And so, God's providence, right? God's sovereignty. God is in control. And we see here the butler forgot Joseph. I don't even think he knew his name, as we'll find out later. He was just a Hebrew slave, right? But you know what? God's timing is always perfect. And what is it you think ought to be happening right now? What is it? Well, maybe God is having you wait because God knows what's best for your life. So we'll continue with chapter 41, Lord willing, next time.